Good afternoon, fellow Arcticans. It's a new term that I have coined today, and I greet you all with that term as the highest compliment. Thank you to Alice Rogoff, the founder of this summit. I remember attending it in its first years in Girdwood, Alaska, and how it's grown. And to President Grimson and to all of the distinguished guests here today, I greet you. This term, Arcticans, defines our shared values of cooperation here in our Arctic village. It reminds me of our Nullagatuck, a community gathering that we have in Barrow. Alice has been to it. It's a whaling festival where we share whale among all of the village residents and those that come from places like I represent in Anchorage to visit. And we all sit around in an arena in a circle, and it's shared. The whale, not just the whaling captains get to partake, but all of the community residents. And so we're here today not to share a whale, but to share our ideas. And I'm going to propose some today that might be controversial to some of you, as other ideas throughout this conference have been controversial to others of us. But that fundamentally is what President Grimson and Alice Rogoff have done, in my opinion, in expanding this Arctic Circle, is to help us broaden our ideas as the Arctic grows. This is a time of unprecedented and new opportunities and international unity among the people of the Arctic and our nations. For most of us here in the room, the idea of being an Arctic nation is not new. But frankly, the Arctic has not necessarily been part of the American national identity. And in many ways, it's being formed as we speak. You're hearing those like Admiral Papp and Fran Ulmer and others who are leading the State Department on the stage discuss those thoughts, and you're present as history's being made. But it's not new to Alaskans. It's been a part of our heritage for thousands of years. Alaska is what makes the United States an Arctic nation. It's very personal to us. And so I'm honored to be here as an Alaskan resident, a lifelong Alaskan, an Alaskan state senator for 14 years of service, and the co-chair of the Alaska Arctic Policy Commission, to speak to you today to reflect on the importance of our commission's leadership in the growing role of our Arctic destiny. I was asked today to speak on the state of Alaska's Arctic, and I'm here to tell you that the state of Alaska's Arctic is strong. We're living in the Arctic, surviving, thriving, exploring, and producing in the Arctic as we have for millennia. Alaskans are cautiously hopeful about the new emerging Arctic. We're hopeful that the new opportunities that are coming with the changing Arctic will benefit the people who live there, the Arcticans. We are cautious because of the concern we feel that decision makers outside of Alaska might limit our ability to advantage ourselves of the new Arctic, to respond, to adapt to what is already transpiring in our own backyard. Let me tell you a personal story that helps define how I feel. I grew up in Anchorage, Alaska, the largest city in our state. It's roughly the population of the country of Iceland, 329,000 people. Now, I remember what life was like before and after the construction of the Trans-Alaska Pipeline, the first large Arctic infrastructure project in the American Arctic. The pipeline's construction changed my life and my opportunities as a young Alaskan in immeasurable ways, for which I am eternally grateful. The pipeline meant a growing opportunity for an economy, a stable budget for my state, and access to things that we'd never had before: paved roads, electricity into darker corners, better education, access to medical care, jobs, economic growth, things that led to self-determination, self-actualization, and freedom, things that others were already taking for granted in the lower 48. The Trans-Alaska Pipeline, that one single infrastructure project, has in large part funded our state for the last 40 years and provided 20% of the domestic supply of energy for the United States of America for most of my lifetime, giving the United States a backstop for national energy security during the Iranian Revolution and OPEC oil embargoes of the 1970s. Ironically, the biggest hurdle we had to overcome as Alaskans to build it was not the challenging engineering, the remote locations, or the harsh climate of the Arctic. It was, in fact, our own federal government. And in the end, the project benefited the nation as much as it benefited Alaskans. In the Alaska Arctic Policy Commission, we look to America's Arctic as having that potential to provide the next generation of legacy projects like the Trans-Alaska Pipeline, to provide a future opportunity of self-determination for our children and our grandchildren, life-changing legacy projects. Alaska's offshore resources are an opportunity to improve America's energy security, create jobs for our communities, to keep the Trans-Alaska Oil Pipeline operating, which is a vital lifeline in the state of Alaska. The most recent environmental study on oil and gas development in the American Arctic was just released by the U.S. federal government on Friday. Many of you have probably read that report. The new draft envisions that up to 4.3 billion barrels of oil could be produced in a period for up to 7 decades, much more than the potential of the $1 billion barrel estimate that had been released in previous studies. We're also working hard in the Commission and as a state to integrate renewable energy sources into a future energy portfolio. But in the meantime, as Alaskans, we must seek energy security, and as a nation, that will include hydrocarbons. This is a reality and not a theory. Not too many years ago, the United States of America imported over 60% of its petroleum from outside countries. Americans and Alaskans don't ever want to be in that position again. As recent as 2012, we imported over 40% of our petroleum from countries, many of which were hostile to our ideology, countries that discriminate against women and oppress their populations. Historically, and most recently, many of the U.S. foreign policy decisions have been driven by the need for importation of hydrocarbon security, resulting in the unnecessary loss of generations of young men and women on battlefields far away from their homes. Let me tell you what energy independence would mean for Alaskans. It would mean that the conditions of many of our Arcticans, my friends, their family, their children, their grandchildren, that they're living in would be improved, that they would have an opportunity for a better life. Many of my people live in conditions that are akin to the third world, without access to clean drinking water or medical care, places where residents will spend over half of their annual income on energy to light and heat their homes, where unemployment, domestic violence, and substance abuse exceed the national United States averages. Moving toward energy independence would be the single largest driver of economic development in the American Arctic. It would mean jobs, new infrastructure, and new opportunities for small and large businesses alike. Another example I'd like to highlight for you where Alaska has been empowering our Arcticans and responding to an already changing Arctic so that human adaptation can occur is the Red Dog Mine. There's a slide up here of it. Construction of this mine began in 1987. It's been heralded as an example of sustainable mining and corporate social responsibility. Working closely with the regional Native Corporation, they engineered a 52-mile transportation route between the mine and the seaport. Let me give you an example of how this works. During caribou migration, the Subsistence Advisory Council has the authority to stop all transportation and similar powers to control operations to allow for whale hunting during the spring. What's important to remember, ladies and gentlemen, that although this arrangement for the committee is there, they have veto authority over all operations, this power has never been exercised, not one time, because of the successful cooperation in this partnership. Red Dog Mine is a great example of Arctic heritage, a new Arctic reality, and responsible resource development coming together in a way that benefits our people, our local Arctican residents. It's an example of how projects can respect the indigenous people, their heritage, the region as a whole, and also to allow competitive business to flourish into a cash economy locally and to allow for a global product like zinc to flourish. It's an example of the old and the new Arctic, not just coexisting with each other, but thriving because of each other. Developing our Arctic is not just about our minerals. It's also about developing our people, their language, their art, their innovation, and their unique way of thinking. With climate change and the opening of the Arctic comes the opportunity for unprecedented cross-pollination of art, culture, and innovation within our lifetimes, making for a better world. We were all witness to one example of that last night with the launch of the first Arctic video game, Never Alone, a game that highlights and shares the unique heritage of the Inuit people, developed in partnership with the Cook Inlet Tribal Council. Development doesn't have to overlook the connection between Alaska's Indigenous people and the land. On the contrary, we have a shared responsibility to account for those who are closest to the changing climate, those whose lives have been complicated and altered due to geopolitical issues far from their home, but will bear the greatest risks. As we get ready to receive the Arctic Council torch from Canada, we'd like to compliment them on their priority of economic development for the people of the Arctic. We'd like to see a higher billing given that by the United States of America. It's not that we don't believe that the State Department priorities of climate change and ocean stewardship are important, but we have a fundamental fear that their response to these priorities will leave Alaskans penalized. The changing climate in the Arctic is not new to us. We're watching it happen. We're right there. We're on the ground. We're watching our permafrost melt, our shores erode, and we're on the verge of having some of the world's first climate change refugees. But Alaskans are not afraid of change. What we're afraid of is the inability to develop our resources in a way that will allow us to meaningfully adapt to that change. We all speak of the desire for sustainable and resilient communities. But one that is resilient is one that can adapt to changes both internally and externally. The lack of infrastructure in the American Arctic should not be a barrier to development of natural resources, shipping routes, and tourism. These activities are going to happen on a global scale, whether Alaska is a participant or not. This lack of infrastructure at the speed at which global development in the Arctic is occurring should be a call to action for all of us, to develop, to build, not simply to shut down and lock up, to sit idly by as we lack the response capability to deal with inevitable human blunders. In wrap-up, our federal government will have a large role to play in this new emerging Arctic, and we look forward to working with them at the Alaska Arctic Policy Commission. As they turn their attention north, we're hopeful that they will not forget their responsibility for things like ports and roads and icebreakers. We're hopeful that they will be fulfilling their responsibilities and look to us as help. Alaskans have a history and the expertise of developing and protecting the Arctic responsibly and effectively. As the United States is grappling with its new Arctic identity, it reminds me of the race to discover the North Pole. We can all remember there were two predominant approaches to that race. One was Frederick Cook. He was part of a new wave of explorers who took a keen interest in the indigenous people as they came across. He took time to learn their dialects, to adopt their diet. He enlisted the help of indigenous Arctic people to reach the pole. The other was Robert Peary, who during the expedition to Greenland in 1897 ordered his men to open the graves of several natives who had died and sold their remains to the American Museum of Natural History as anthropological specimens. He also brought back living natives, 2 men, a woman, and 3 children, and dropped them off as study to a museum. I share this with you now because it seems apparent to Alaskans that the United States federal government is, in a way, waking up to the fact that the United States is, in fact, an Arctic nation. We're pleased that this message is being heard, but we want to remind the world that Alaska is living in, developing, and been protecting the Arctic America for decades. We're not charging into the unknown, but rather we're continuing to do the things that we've been doing well. Our other Arctic nation neighbors are living proof that we can develop the Arctic responsibly. Alaskans are cautiously optimistic that we will be at the table when decisions are made and that our federal government will not view Alaska inside a snow globe, placed on their desks far away in Washington, D.C. as anthropological specimens. We're hopeful that our federal counterparts will see the benefits of Cook's approach. The changing Arctic and all of its opportunities and risks are truly a race to the moon or a second race to the North Pole. Alongside other Arcticans, we have proven and want to continue to prove that we can continue to responsibly develop our Arctic resources for the benefit of our people, the nation, and our global economy. Progress and opportunity are never deterred. At best, they can be directed. And we propose at the Arctic Commission that we can direct them for the benefit of all Arcticans. Thank you.